Welcome, everybody. My name's Tim Sexton, and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. First of all, I just want to thank you all for coming tonight. I know many of you probably came from work or from other things at the end of the day, so we really appreciate you making time for this. The project that we're talking about tonight, it's called Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation, Transportation Decarbonization. The way that we lovingly refer to it is reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. That's a little maybe easier to get your head around. And this project, it's a partnership between a number of state agencies. MnDOT is just sort of the face because we're talking really about transportation. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the origins of this project really start back in 2007 with the Next Generation Energy Act. And I'm curious, how many people here have heard of the Next Generation Energy Act? Nobody. Okay, that's great. One in the back. No, that's great. So what that was back in 2007, the legislature and Governor Plenty at the time passed this law that set these economy-wide targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions. Starting in 2000 with a base year of 2005, and they set them for 2015, 2025, and 2050. And Abbi Finnis with the Great Plains Institute is going to talk a little bit more about that. But the point is, they set these climate goals. And so at the time, the electricity sector was the #1 source of emissions in Minnesota. And I think somewhat inspired by that act and those goals and subsequent regulations and other efforts of the state, the electricity sector has gotten a lot cleaner over time. The transportation sector, however, has seen some small reductions, but starting in 2016, they became the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Minnesota. And actually since 2016, while the numbers are not yet official, estimates show that the emissions are increasing from transportation. And so in 2017, sorry to throw out all these dates, but the Minnesota Department of Transportation said, transportation is not making a lot of progress right now to reduce emissions. We need to do something about that. And so as an agency, we set up goals from that statute. We said we're going to apply them directly to transportation voluntarily. These are economy-wide goals. They don't specify who has to do what necessarily. But MnDOT said, we think this is important, so we're gonna apply these to the transportation sector, to our agency operations, and then also to our highway construction program. So when we construct projects, the fuel that goes into the construction, the pavement, the materials that go into the pavement, all that. That was 2017. In the last 2 years, there hasn't been a lot of progress. And so earlier this winter, we said, you know what, we need to do something about this. And at the same time, transportation's been changing, and we no longer can just do a lot of this work by ourselves, right? We're beyond the stage where MnDOT just builds roads and bridges. We need help, we need partnerships. I mean, transportation is changing. We're starting to think about health, so we need partnerships with health departments. We're starting to think about connected and automated vehicles. That brings in the private sector, the nonprofit sector. There's all these changes that really require agencies to think differently and create new partnerships. And this is another example of that. And so as we talk about the ways to reduce emissions from transportation, it's really important that we think about the partners and developing partnerships. And that's why this effort tonight is a partnership with the Department of Commerce, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Quality Board, and the McKnight Foundation. And what this effort looks like, and what we're really going to be talking tonight about is kind of, we looked at this project in 3 parts. The first one was we met with technical experts, about 50 state and national experts in transportation, in biofuels, utility sector experts, to help us understand if we wanted to model these reductions to get a sense of what kind of reductions might be possible in the transportation sector, what are the data we should be using? What assumptions should go into that? What should we be thinking about? And so those experts, we had a couple of meetings with them, And they informed this second phase, which is to really take all that information and look at and model kind of what reductions might be possible using different strategies. And we're going to get into those strategies in more depth in just a moment. And then the third phase is to say, well, these strategies are great, but it's not really good for the state agencies on their own to just come up with this path forward. We really need to talk and listen to folks around the state and understand what all of you and how you all feel is the best path forward. See if we missed things, and just generally provide feedback on the effort to date. Because the more people we hear from, the better the actions we take are going to be. And so that's what we're doing right now. So this is our fourth location for public meetings. So we've met with folks in Minneapolis, in Bemidji, Duluth, meeting obviously here in Marshall, and then tomorrow we're meeting with folks in Rochester. And then we've also done an online webinar where we've gotten feedback that way as well. And so sort of wrapping up then, what we do with all this information is going to be, we're going to hear from all of you, compile this in July, and release some sort of report in August. But tonight we're going to hear from all of you and share some information that we've put together so far. But before we do that, I want to introduce two special guests to give you a more official welcome from somebody locally, from Brad Rose from right here at MMU. And then we're going to hear from Commissioner Steve Kelly with the Department of Commerce.
Thanks, Tim. Welcome to Marshall and to the MMU offices. My name is Brad Rose. I'm the general manager here at MMU. The most important thing I have to tell you is through that door and down the hall is the restrooms. There are some refreshments. Help yourself if you feel moved to do that. We are taping this evening for Studio One local access channel. Thanks for coming. A little bit about MMU. Our utility serves water and electricity here in Marshall. How many of you are customers of MMU? One, two, a few of you are. Thank you. Our electricity that we sell to you is 43% renewable. And I'm happy to announce that beginning next year, any of our customers that want to go to a higher percentage, they can all go all the way to 100 if they want, can let us know that, and we have a program to sell you renewable energy credits to allow you to do that. I'm just planting the seed for some more promotion that you'll see later this year. How many of you from Wilmer buy from the Wilmer Municipal Utilities? Anybody? I think I heard some Wilmer folks here. All right. But you may see some of that Wilmer area. One other program that we're going to run out in 2020 is a program to incentivize charging stations in homes, level 2 charging stations, and to incentivize one public charging station per year going forward. So just like we do things like that to incentivize energy efficiency measures being put into place in our electric customers' homes and businesses, we incentivize that action to cause it to happen with good effect, such as these LED lights being installed many places. We're going to incentivize charging stations, which is, as we talk about this topic throughout the evening, we'll all realize that that's one of the hurdles we have to work on. So with that, I just want to welcome you to Marshall and enjoy your evening.
Thanks, Brad, for welcoming us here. I'm Steve Kelly. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Commerce and started at the same time as Governor Walz did. I'm one of the governor's appointments. Most of you probably don't know what the Department of Commerce does or why we'd be involved in this conversation. So one of our areas of responsibilities is advocating with respect to energy policy in front of the Public Utilities Commission and then implementing the recommendations or the decisions that they make. And we also administer, among other things, the low-income heating assistance program that's funded by the federal government and also the weatherization program that serves low-income property owners. And so we've got a strong interest in energy for both heating and electricity in a variety of forms. We also have a responsibility for evaluating all forms of and uses of energy, including energy used for transportation, which is one of the reasons that we're partnering with MnDOT on this issue. On behalf of the governor and the lieutenant governor, thank you for participating in this program because this project fits at least 3 of the core pieces of the administration's agenda. So one is that the governor and lieutenant governor believe that climate change is an existential problem that the state needs to do something about. And this is one of the ways that we're exploring tackling that problem. The second is that these kinds of partnerships fit the instructions that we've gotten from them for the commissioners to work together. And so it isn't just a partnership of agencies, but it's also a partnership of the leaders of those agencies who are committed to moving the state forward on a variety of fronts, including transportation, as well as continuing the progress that you'll see that we've been making with respect to carbon, CO2 in the electricity sector. And the third is engaging with people everywhere in Minnesota. Oftentimes government talks at people and doesn't do a good enough job listening to the people that we're supposed to be serving. So the governor's belief in a One Minnesota approach to things includes making sure that we are talking to people everywhere in Minnesota, including them in our approach to problem solving and making sure that the benefits of the solutions we develop serve everybody in Minnesota. One of the great things about renewable energy jobs, for example, and southwestern Minnesota has contributed a lot to this, is that 40% of the jobs in renewable energy are in greater Minnesota. And we'd like to continue to see that kind of growth in a variety of ways as we tackle the work on climate change and decarbonizing not just transportation, but other uses of energy. So thank you very much for being part of this conversation to find ways and to explore things that will work as we're trying to solve this challenge. So have a great evening.
Okay. Great, thank you, Steve. So my name is Abbi and I work for a nonprofit organization in Minneapolis called the Great Plains Institute, along with Jesse Wyatt, and we are leading the stakeholder engagement efforts for this project. And while we didn't do the modeling, we are going to set the context and describe what's going on with the modeling to set up the conversation tonight. And since we're a little bit of a smaller group, I kind of want to mix up what we're going to do and do a quick round of introductions just to see kind of who's in the room and a little bit of an icebreaker. So the question is, or state your name and then what is your favorite way to travel? So I'll go first. My name is Abbi and I love to ride my bike. It's right here.
My name is Ola and I prefer to drive.
Drive.
My name is Roger and I prefer to drive.
Darlene, I prefer to drive.
Ian, I like walking, but I can't walk everywhere, so I have to drive too.
My name is Kelly. I also like to ride my bicycle.
Great.
My name is Lydia, and I like to walk when I can, and sometimes I have to drive.
Yeah.
Mark, bike when I can, autopilot when I can.
My name is Misty. I generally drive or ride.
What's your favorite way?
My favorite way is like to ride in a boat.
I was waiting for a boat. We're in Minnesota, you guys. Yeah.
My name is Sean, and my favorite way to travel is to fly.
Like on a hang gliding or like
just on a plane, leave.
My name is Eric, and I prefer subways and trains.
My name is Jesse Wyatt. I think I'm going to join the walking crew. I like to walk.
Okay, Steve.
I like to walk, but mostly end up driving.
Oh yeah, we're going to everybody.
Tim, and I like to bike, but I mostly drive.
Yeah, my name is Cole, and I like to walk when I can.
In the back.
I'm Deb. I like to walk too.
I'm Craig. I like to bike.
I'm Emma. I like to use trains.
I'm Sarah. I like trains and subways.
I'm Jeff. I like trains.
Okay, Leah?
I'm Leah, and I like go biking.
Great. All right, so a whole bunch of transportation options all in one room. Thank you for participating in that. So real quick, does anybody not have a smartphone? Great. 2 for 2 today. You are going to need your phones in a little bit. If your service isn't great, there is a wireless connection. So you can pass this around if you want to sign up for wireless, and we'll get into the instructions for that in a little bit. So we are going to dig into these icebreaker questions just to get a sense of using this program that we're going to use for conversation later on. And then Jesse and I are going to get into setting the context with the modeling presentation. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion around that. And then we're going to break up and go back to these tables, and we have a little bit of an exercise for you at those tables. And then we're going to use our phones again for getting your feedback on what you envision for the transportation future. And then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up, and we'll be on our way. So a couple of ground rules to start. The first one is just phones at the ready. We really want to use that for getting your feedback. No acronyms. That's really kind of for us. We often speak in acronyms, and you might not know what it is and might not want to ask. So we'll try to remember to spell those out. And if you are speaking and using it, try to remember to spell it out. And just be respectful of each other and listen, and feel free to share your ideas. And then step up and step back is kind of just, if you're somebody who likes to talk a lot, maybe take a second and see if somebody else wants to share their answers as well. And if you're somebody who's maybe more introverted, we want to hear from you. So step up and share those ideas when you have them. All right, so get out your phones. If you are on wireless or your service, go to www.menti, that's MENTI.com. All right, and once you are there, you will enter the code 107089. So 107089. Everybody on? Just about, not quite.
The code is
yeah, go ahead.
107089. And the website is menti, MENTI.com.
Okay, we're just about there. So the first question, we're going to just ask a few softball questions. Where are you coming from today? Yep, it should pop up on your screen. Home, Atwater, New London. Oh, there we go. So we can. Get it. We'll wait for just a second. E Street and Marshall. Somebody was very specific. So E Street and Marshall. Forgot a little A in there. The gym, home, laboratory. Who came from the laboratory? You did? What laboratory?
At the university.
At the university? Okay. Are you a scientist?
Yes.
Okay. What kind of scientist?
Environmental scientist.
Great. Nice. All right. All right. Did we get those phones?
You can keep going.
Do I just click it? Oh, there we go. Okay. What is your home zip code? Good. All right. So most seem to be.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Did you wanna?
From the 56258. All right. And then how do you most frequently get around? So we kind of did this one a little bit. We went back and forth from how we like to get around versus how we do get around. There are options including walking, biking, fully electric vehicle, plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, hybrid vehicle, gasoline vehicle, diesel, public transportation, personal mobility device, rideshare, scooter, or multiple modes. Couple more. Okay. All right, so mostly gasoline, that's what we're finding in most of the cities that we go to. We did actually have one group, the evening group in Duluth was the only group, I think they were at like 33% gasoline vehicles. But otherwise it's been majority gasoline vehicles. Okay, so who are the multiple modes of transportation? There's two of you. Three of you. Yeah. What modes are they?
Well, I bike and walk and drive.
Great.
Plane. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
take the bus. So that's multiple modes.
It is. Yep. Anybody else? No? Okay. Next question. Where do you work? So this includes trade, industry, business, nonprofit, academic institution, self-employed, government, retired, student, or other. Okay. So it's looking like business and retired for those top two. And then we have nonprofit, academic, student, other, and self-employed just popped up. And student. Which are the students? So we have a high school student and PhD?
No.
What is it?
I'm an undergrad. I'm
Oh,
actually
okay.
done, but still
Okay.
conducting some experiments.
Great, cool. Okay. Oh, they're still coming. What are these others? Yeah.
Pastor?
Okay, great. Another?
Medical.
Medical? Cool, thank you. Okay. So that was just really an exercise to get you used to the website. We'll dig into that a little bit more later. But now, yeah, we'll get into setting the context for, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the kind of the state of emissions is like in Minnesota right now, and then Jesse will talk about the modeling. So Tim spoke about the Next Generation Energy Act, which came about in 2007, and it was one of the strongest goals in the country at the time. And it was setting an 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2050, and then with these interim targets of 15% reduction by 2015 and a 30% reduction by 2025. So this graph shows us where we've been with our emissions since 2005, or 1990 really. So you can see the emissions rising through the 90s, and then kind of mid-2000s they start coming back down. And this is total Minnesota greenhouse gas emissions. And we came pretty close to achieving that 15% reduction in 2015, but we're not really on a trajectory to meet those goals in 2025 and 2050. And so we want to start thinking about what sorts of things need to happen and be put in place to start meeting those goals. And so you'll see on the next slide that there are some areas, go ahead, where we have been making progress in meeting those emission reductions, and there's some areas where we just really haven't. And so on the left here, Where's that pointer? Yeah. There you go. Okay, on the left here, this kind of teal is transportation emissions, and it's gone down from 2005 to 16 by about 8% in that time period, and then at the very end here, it kind of starts going back up a little bit. And then the next one is where we really saw the biggest decline in emissions, and that's in the electricity sector, and that's really largely driven by our renewable energy standards. So it was spoken about before that 43% of Marshall's electricity is coming from renewable sources, and so it's really cleaning up that generation mix that has resulted in those reductions over that time. The green here is agriculture and forestry and land use, so that's kind of had a little bit more of a peak and valley trajectory over that time. And then the remainders are industrial, residential, commercial emissions. And then this last purple one is from waste. So now kind of focusing in on what we're talking about today is surface transportation. So it's those on-road vehicles, your regular cars, trucks, buses, RVs, motorcycles, etc. So we're really not talking about air travel, we're not talking about boats, we're not talking about freight. It's really just those on-road vehicles. And that green in the pie chart is the percentage of emissions, of total emissions in the state that are on-road vehicles. And so the largest portion of that is really made up of light-duty trucks and automobiles, so sedans, SUVs, light pickup trucks. And then the next largest is going to be those bigger pickup trucks, bigger vehicles, and heavy-duty trucks like semis, garbage trucks. A smaller portion comes from buses and motorcycles. And then actually somewhat significant is 4% of mobile air conditioning, and so that's just the refrigerants, the cooling gases that are in our air conditioners in our cars, and then also in larger trucks that require cooling as well. It's okay. So again, this is looking at emissions, but just as on-road emissions and the history of that. You can see that it started going down and then kind of started coming back up, but we didn't hit that 15% target in the on-road emissions, and so that's what we really want to talk about is how do we start getting that curve to bend on this downward path toward the 80% goals. So why do we want to model? The modeling allows us to look at what opportunities are available to reducing emissions, as well as what some of the challenges are going to be in getting there. It also gives us a sense of what actions are going to give us the biggest impact. And so we can start thinking about how we want to prioritize for what people want and what emission reductions are going to result from those actions. When do they need to happen? If a vehicle, once it's sold, is on the road for 15 to 20 years before it kind of gets out of service, we're going to have two opportunities to replace that vehicle with something else by 2050. So it has a 20-year lifespan, and then the next vehicle that replaces it would have a 20-year lifespan. So you can kind of think about it in those terms as well. How do they interact? If we're going to electrify a bunch of vehicles, what does that do to demand on the electricity system, and what does the electricity generation look like? And so how are those emissions interrelated? And then how can they be combined to effectively maximize that balance and the prioritization of what Minnesotans want? And then really what we want to do is just kind of start this discussion. We want to hear from you. We have a model that's up there as a conversation piece, and we just really want to hear back from all of you on what you think that ought to look like. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessie, and she will show you the model.
I'm going to do that. Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Wyatt. If you recall, I like to walk. So what I'm going to do now, Abby sort of teed up the context of what we're doing statewide and what that looks like from an emissions perspective. So I'm going to walk through what MnDOT did, how they partnered with a consulting firm in California to do something called a pathways model. And we'll start with the scenario and the assumptions behind that at a very high level, and then dive a little bit into the results. And I just want to caveat, if there's any data wonks out there or people who love to dig into the numbers, all of this information is available online, and it goes way more in depth, all of the assumptions and the numbers behind this modeling, and that can be found at the MnDOT Pathways for Sustainability website. It's a a home-based web page for all of that information. And there's, yeah, we'll get a little bit into it. So to start off, I just want to reiterate, like Abby said, we did this modeling, but the outcomes of that are not prescriptive, right? It's one way you can envision or think about a potential future for the state, but it's not necessarily the right way, and it's not the way that MnDOT is saying it should be. It's just that conversation piece to get things flowing and get conversation started. And so that did come out of that technical stakeholder advisory committee, so there were experts who kind of were giving their 2 cents, but now it's time for your voices, the public voices. Is that realistic? Is that feasible? What do you see that you like? What don't you like? And then we're gonna highlight 2 scenarios. So what you're looking at here is the same emissions uptick as before, so that black dotted line is our historic emission levels for surface transportation specifically. You see 3 lines diverging off of that. The top one, the yellow line, is what we're going to call our reference or business as usual scenario. So that's what we assumed would happen if nobody did anything differently. If everyone continued to do the same behavior that you've been doing, and then including things like electric vehicle sales trends and some trajectories that have been consistent over time, if that all stays steady, but nobody does anything sort of revolutionary or makes big behavior changes, what you're going to see is it stays flat for a little while, and then it starts to uptick actually. So that's coming from more people in Minnesota, so more people driving, more cars on the road. And so how are we going to mitigate that? And then what you see next is this red line. We're going to call that our 80 by 50 scenario. So what we're showing there is an example of achieving 80% emission reductions over the 2005 levels by the year 2050. So it's a pretty significant departure from the doing nothing to then achieving that 80% reduction. And then finally, you'll see this blue line. And that's what MnDOT decided to do was imagine what if we went a little bit further. So what that's modeling is a 100 by 50 or 100% emissions reductions, some call that carbon neutrality, by the year 2050. And there were sort of 2 motivators for why we might want to explore not only going for 80, but seeing what 100 looks like. The first is some folks maybe think that transportation has more to contribute to the statewide economy-wide emissions reduction goals. And the second is that there's some climate science that's suggesting that 100% might be a better goal to shoot for based on patterns that they're seeing. So what MnDOT wanted to explore in that case was what's the gap? What more would we need to do if we shot for 80 versus if we shot for 100? But for the sake of our sanity today and time, we're only going to talk about that red line, the 80 by 50 scenario, which is what is in parallel with the Next Generation Energy Act that Tim talked about at the beginning. So how do we do that, right? You saw a gap between the doing nothing scenario and the 80% emissions reductions, but like what happened in the middle? And there are 4 big levers that you can kind of push on to activate behavior change that results in emissions reductions. So the first is efficiency, and that's very generally just saying you're going to increase the fuel economy, so you're going to drive more efficient vehicles, and that includes things like electric or hybrid or biofuel, and then you're also going to reduce your driving, so reduce the total miles traveled. The second is electric vehicles, so increasing the number of electric vehicles on the road, as well as increasing the efficiency of those electric vehicles. What that would look like would be assuming that a certain percentage of people you know are electing or are able to purchase an electric vehicle when it's time to replace that old vehicle that broke down. The third is low carbon fuels, and so that's increasing low carbon biofuels, which can be changing the way that the biofuel is manufactured or changing the way that the crop that goes into the fuel is grown. And it can also be changing the way that we produce electricity that provides fuel for electric vehicles. And then the final one, Abby touched on this, is the refrigerants piece. So right now, the way that you use air conditioning in your vehicle, it's a chemical-based driven process, and there's leakages associated with that. And right now, that chemical is a pretty potent, results in pretty potent emissions, and it has historically, but as new cars are manufactured, they're replacing it with a less potent or like less emissions intensive chemical when there are leakages. And so it's just assuming over time that old vehicles are being taken off the road and that chemical is being replaced with the cleaner version. But in the car, it would feel the same. So that's very high level. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how we push those levers in this modeling. So what you start to see are those building blocks of the model being activated between the year 2015 and the year 2050. So an example, I won't go into every single one, but might be looking to the increase of electric vehicle light duty sales. So what this model assumed, for example, was ding, by a certain year, half of the people who who are going to purchase a new vehicle are going to elect or are able to purchase an electric vehicle. And then by the year 2050, 80%. So most of the people that are able to purchase or replace their car with an electric vehicle. So that's an example of things that the model started to assume to then result in those emissions reductions. And they are all working in aggregate with each other. So now I'll talk a little bit about what it looked like when all of that went into this pathways model and it came out with a result. So there are two ways, as a primer to that, there are two ways roughly to talk about emissions over time and how they're being affected. So everything under this area, under this dotted line, which is your reference scenario or your do nothing, are emissions, and there's two different types. So the gray area is going to be your remaining emissions. So even though you're changing behavior, things are happening to the electricity sector or to the way that we are using transportation, there's still some emissions remaining by the end of it. So what composes that gray area? And then on the flip side, what emissions were reduced and how were those building blocks activated to result in those emissions reductions? So we'll dive into each of those two things. So we start with the remaining emissions. So in this 80 by 50 potential vision, this is what it looks like over time from 2015 to 2050. You see, as we talked about, the bulk of emissions coming from light duty autos and trucks, a little bit in medium and heavy duty, and then very minimal from the buses, RV, motorcycle, and the mobile refrigerants. But the key takeaway here is that no vehicle sector or vehicle category got an out, right? They all had a role to play in ultimately reducing emissions by 2050. So then we flip that, right? So we looked at the remaining emissions, but how did we get rid of all of these emissions up here? And that was a combination of these 7 things. So at the top, we start with the fuel economy standards, and that's assuming that the current fuel economy standards stay in place. So we just kind of get to squeeze those off the top and say that cars are going to continue to be more efficient. So say for this year you get 24 miles per gallon highway, that's somewhere around the state average. In 10 years, that's going to be 35, for example. And so just assuming that it's going to continue to increase helps shave off those top emissions. The second one in red is a reduction in urban vehicle miles traveled. And so that's just saying you're going to drive less, right? There are fewer miles driven every year, and it assumes that it's easier to do that in an urban setting than in a rural setting. We have 3 blue blocks or wedges. The top one is light-duty electric vehicles. So that's that conversion of taking a gasoline or diesel vehicle off of the road, replacing it with an electric vehicle, in combination with making it cleaner to power or fuel an electric vehicle. And the same thing for medium-duty and heavy-duty, but then you also include hybrids. Green captures the biofuels, so that's increasing the blend of the biofuel, decreasing the emissions associated with growing or processing the biofuel, and then increasing the use of it. And finally, we have these mobile refrigerants at the bottom, so switching from that potent chemical to then the less potent version of it. So one thing that this graph is really useful for is it's a hypothetical vision, right? So if you're sitting there and you're looking at this and you're thinking, everyone could get an electric vehicle. I truly believe that by year 2040. So that light blue wedge is going to be a lot bigger. That gives you the freedom to be less aggressive in a different measure. So what you think is feasible. And then in the inverse, if you think something isn't aggressive or is too aggressive, so I don't think we can achieve that with biofuels, that you maybe shrink that wedge, but then you think creatively about how to compensate for the gap you just created with another lever or another action. But ultimately, it can be done, right? So this shows, and through the process that we put into that model, that it's pretty aggressive, but were we to do all of those things in transportation, we would achieve the 80% emissions reductions. So it's very high level, right? It doesn't care. The model assumes that you're reducing driving or changing your fuel intensity or changing your fuel efficiency, but it doesn't care how you do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I'll just really briefly give an example of what that might look like as a behavior in practice for each of those different wedges that we talked about. So the first one is improving fuel economy. That typically comes through some kind of mandate coming from the top down. The state of California has fuel economy standards. Other states have fuel economy standards. We've seen those to be pretty effective at reducing transportation emissions, but they're by no means the only way to do so. We can reduce the vehicle miles traveled or the miles driven through a ton of different strategies. Some of them start to look like smart, dense city designs, so changing the way that neighborhoods are built so that they're easier to walk in or easier to bike in. A lot of folks said that they liked walking, but they mostly ended up driving. And so why is that, right? And then things like incentivizing carpooling or ride sharing. And that could be riding with your friend or riding with your relative, but it could also be a service like Lyft or Uber, if folks are familiar with that, or improving public transit. You can increase sales of electric vehicles through things like consumer rebates, through state vehicle targets for state fleets or different things like that, and then also increasing or improving the maintenance of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So if you elect to buy an electric vehicle, you want to be sure that if you're getting from point A to point B, you can charge your vehicle on the way, or you can charge it in an emergency. To reduce the carbon intensity of biofuels, which is kind of a buzzword, all that means is that the fuel is cleaner through the total process from growth to use, or as someone earlier said, from seed to feed. And that can be done through things like agricultural practices, changing the way that you manage the soil, and then the process itself, so when you're converting it to biofuel, that, as well as through policies like a low carbon fuel standard. So mandating that from the top down. And then finally, you can increase the lower carbon electricity, which is the cleaner electricity. If you think intuitively, it's something like renewables, right? So implementing cleaner electricity standards, MMU and other utilities around the state have already started to do that, setting greenhouse gas reductions for utilities, and then retiring some fuels like coal. So thank you all for going through that with me. I hope it was informative. And now if we have any questions, I think I'm available, and then Tim is also available if we want to dig into any of this. Yeah.
You mentioned improving public transportation. Is that primarily is that envisioned as being focused mainly in urban centers, or is that going to get some attention out here where the rural economy is moving from individual small towns to economic hubs and having small towns with transportation services into those hubs that are more effective than the bus services we have today, which make one trip into the, in Wilmer, I can go to Atwater, or from Atwater to Wilmer at 9 in the morning, and then come back to Atwater at 5, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's great feedback, right? So all the model cares about is that people are driving less. They don't care, the model doesn't care how that happens. So that's feedback, right? That if there were better public transit options, you feasibly could conceptualize there being fewer people driving, right? So that's great feedback. Yeah.
Have you done a cost analysis for individuals that are going to be participating in this? What are the cost of electricity? What's going to be the cost of charging stations as opposed to gasoline costs of today? All these things, have you put all that in perspective as well? Is it who's going to provide the charging stations? How are they going to be put up? Is it going to be taxed in order to do that? Is the state and federal funding going to do that, which is my money, of course?
Those are all great questions. So the scope of this, the answer is no. This didn't take account cost. It's talking about methodologies and strategies, what makes sense for folks across the state, where and how, and then that cost, if Tim wants to add, is part of a later conversation.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit too. And so one of the reasons that cost isn't included here is there's tons of different ways to do some of these different things. And
are they already established to know that they're going to be a specific amount of money cost, or are you all guessing?
Well, I mean, so what we're talking about here, so we're saying if you want to go to that slide that has the reductions, that's kind of a good one for just the conversation. So like the fuel economy standards one, for example, at the top, that's pink,
Yeah.
right? The cost of that one, well, right now, that assumes that the current fuel economy standards are revoked. And so the cost of that one, for example, is really, you could argue there's no cost to continue the current fuel economy standards, but revoking those actually has a cost, which is kind of a confusing one. So maybe that's a bad example. But like light duty electric vehicles, right? So converting cars to, or say you want more electric vehicles out there, and you brought the charging stations, which is important. You could have an individual private investor go buy that charging station and put it in and charge for the electricity. You could have the electric utilities put in that charger because they benefit, right? That's increasing customers for them.
You're making all these as assumptions, so correct?
So and that's one of the reasons there's all these different ways that some of this stuff could happen. And that's why we're not talking so much about cost now. But what we really like to hear from you tonight when we get into the small groups and share some of the things, what are your concerns?
That's my concern.
Yeah, so, or if you have suggestions for the ways that some of these things should happen, that would be good to hear as well.
Doesn't electric vehicles with charging stations, without charging stations, there's a time limit, a certain time frame to recharge, and I don't think that's gonna change it, drastically. It's gonna take time. How many stations is it gonna take for 10 million cars?
I drive 2 electric vehicles. 95% of my charging happens at home overnight while I'm parked in my garage anyway.
What if I want to
just like
go
myself.
from here to California in 2 days?
Yep, so right now, if you drive a Tesla, that's possible because of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure that they have in place. The stops you'd have to make are pretty similar to the stops you'd make on a road trip anyway. It's a different paradigm, it's a different approach because you have fewer options and things like that. Those stations cost anywhere from low 50,000s to high 200,000s depending on the kind of station you put in. And his point is exactly right. The question about how you accomplish that is a question that you ask after you've decided that this is the way that you have to go to get there. And once you start making those cost-benefit trade-offs, you can decide this cost isn't worth it, so we have to do something else instead. Biofuels are too expensive, so we have to invest.
I do have another question concerning that point you just made. Is it necessary, so drastically necessary, that we change our entire habitat?
Yes.
Of how we exist as human beings on this earth?
Yes.
Because why?
Because
our emissions that we emit as human beings as we live and breathe aren't near as much as what Mount St. Helens blew off in
you are wrong.
a matter of a few hours.
That's not true. It's just not.
I tell you what, so part of this, I'm gonna jump in here, though, because there are different views on some of this stuff. We are making the assumption, though, right here, and as Commissioner Kelly mentioned, Governor Walz has made the statement that climate change is an existential threat. Climate change it's real, it's important, and humans are making significant contributions.
That's where I'm coming from.
And
So
that's
you
fine.
don't
So
believe we should make any of these changes?
But I think the whole point of this. No, that's okay. Hey, the point of this conversation, though, is if you don't think that's something we should be focusing on as a state, that's great to hear. But what we're talking about tonight is really, if we want to go this route, what's the best way to do that? And so maybe, even if you it sounds like you might not think that climate change is an issue contributed by humans, you could still think of it, and we'd still like to have you participate in terms of, what about the transportation system of the future, right? So do you think that there's value in having electric vehicles out there? Do you think there's value in promoting the agricultural economy through biofuels and some of the processes associated with that? When we talk about VMT reduction, rethinking our community design to maybe change some of the way we're designing things to make it more danceable, more walkable, more bike-friendly. So some of those things. What I don't want to get into, though, is a climate change discussion, because we've sort of planted the flag. per the governor, is that climate change is real, it's an important thing, and we're trying to make progress towards it. But again, even if you disagree with that, we still want to hear what you think about transportation
Okay,
and
well,
where you want us to
I
go.
guess I'm old school, and I would think that supply and demand would dictate what direction we do go with that. I mean, if electric vehicles become more efficient and less costly than gasoline or diesel-powered vehicles, that's where the demand would focus, and then there would be an industry come from it, whoever
So-
develops it. But to put the industry there
So you prefer a price on
prior
carbon?
to the demand for it, that doesn't work very well.
You prefer a price on carbon instead of trying to pull these levers independently?
No, I'm not even talking about, I'm just
Well,
talking
but that's
basic.
the only way the economy works that way.
Supply and demand is the only way
Yes,
it
but when
works.
you drive your gasoline car, you pump 20 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere that everybody else pays for. And that's not factored into the cost of driving a gasoline car.
Why,
We did the same thing when we had leaded gasoline. When we had leaded gasoline polluted the atmosphere, and everybody had to pay for that.
I have a 75 Harley motorcycle that requires a 91 octane with no, it needs to be non-oxygenated, otherwise I'll ruin my engine.
Okay.
So I don't use ethanol in it. I can't.
That's fine, but when you choose to use that fuel, you are polluting the atmosphere in a different way than if you were choosing to drive a different vehicle that had higher fuel economy. And so you are asking everybody else to pay for that pollution. And the way we solve that is either by putting in fuel economy standards, by putting tax dollars towards electric vehicle infrastructure, or by simply putting a price on carbon and saying the economy will take care of it.
So tell you what, this is actually a really good conversation, but and we probably didn't set this up maybe as well as we could have in terms of, we're gonna go to small groups here in just a minute, and I hope this continues, because we do wanna hear all sides of this, and we wanna hear suggestions from all around.
I'm not trying to generate an argument, I'm just trying to make my point.
But we want to hear from that, but the challenge is, it's going to be easier for us to collect that when we go to the group and have some, write some stuff down. It'd be great
Let's
to
sit
hear.
together.
Can we do that?
We can maybe do that.
Let's do that.
But it'd be great to hear if there are any other questions about the modeling, so that might inform the smaller group discussion. So if you have any questions about kind of what we did and how we thought about it.
So the goal at the end was the 80% total reduction. The mix, is this sort of pulling things out of a hat and seeing what we have to do to get these wedges to land at a place that adds up to 80% target? Or was there some background that went into, this is why I think EVs can be adopted at 40% by X date and 80% by 2050?
Yeah, so it was absolutely the latter. The Technical Advisory Stakeholder Committee had those conversations of what is realistic, how much do we have to push on these, and then is that realistic at all? Is it feasible? And the outcome of those conversations, in their eyes, is that this could be, right? It's aggressive, but it could be. But now we want to hear from you. Do you think it's feasible? What would you like to see? Which, if any, would you like to see moved around? Or is there something we omit? Is there something you would like to see out here that isn't currently included?
So, for example, Abby mentioned the replacement timing for automobiles. So the model is, I know this because earlier this afternoon we did this, so Jesse told me the answer to this question. So I'm going to just repeat it back, and you tell me if I got it wrong. But let's assume that between now and 2050 there are 2 cycles of automobile replacement, so once every 15 years roughly. In the first 15 years, the assumption is that half of people buy new electric vehicles. And the assumption is that in the second round of purchases, everybody is buying electric vehicles. And that, if that happens, if that assumption is correct, that produces that amount of emissions.
And my core question was just, I understand that that's what has to happen to get there. Just that sounds like it is based on a reality of a market analysis that says this can be achieved, rather than this is what we have to do and now we have to find the levers to pull to make it happen.
And those are the data numbers, if you want to dig into that are online and the report's there.
But just to, so you know too, that with every model that there are some assumptions and there's some choices that have to be made.
All models are wrong, some are useful.
Yeah. Yeah, so, but what we did, as Jesse pointed out, was we worked with this advisory group. You know, you could have found an advisory group that would have said all biofuels to get there, and another one that would have said all electrification. We had representations from both of those groups along with a number of others, and so we balanced that feedback as well as we could to make, I think, what represents a model that's realistic, that is achievable but ambitious, but also reflects values of Minnesotans. If you did the same modeling in a different state, you would probably have different wedges.
I have a question. Are there any specifics regarding biofuel? Because that's something I'm really interested in. Now, you mentioned plant biofuel. Is there anything regarding microbial biofuel, like algae, which is something that was created 10 years ago, and it's still, no one's really interested in making it more financially viable or producing it at much larger scale. So is there any specifics on that?
Microbial algae was not a
So
factor.
we didn't look into that or dimethyl ether or synthetic natural gas or some of those other lower carbon options that are out there. But what we did, we talked a little bit about like ethanol and biodiesel. But the reality is the feedstock matters a little bit because we look upstream, so what goes into the production. But what matters more, I would argue, is probably the quote-unquote tailpipe emissions of those. And we're assuming that those are zero carbon at the tailpipe. And so what happens with the biofuels is it's two parts. One is the blend of biofuel, so how much biofuel is mixed with conventional fuel. Right, so if it's a 15% blend, we're assuming more or less 0%, that 15% ethanol has zero emissions at the tailpipe, but it has upstream emissions in the production. And so I don't know how microbial production emissions compare to ethanol or soy, for example. But what we assume is that production and the emissions associated with growing the corn, for example, and processing that and turning it into ethanol, that those decrease over time. And that the way to have a low carbon biofuel is not to produce corn the way we're doing it now and just put in more ethanol, but to make it a real solution here, we need to reduce the energy that goes into that. And so presumably that effort will get it closer to like a microbial or a DME or some of these other stuff.
So the mode of production of the energy that goes into manufacturing the fuel needs to be tackled before you consider how much of the fuel you want to use, or it will be useful to reduce carbon.
Or at the same time.
Yeah, both are important.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no other questions, I think I'll hand it back to Abby, and we'll transition to that small group discussion that we talked about.
Okay, so we are in a second going to go back to these tables, and we have some flip charts on the table. And there's one question that asks about opportunities that you see in transportation, and then the question beneath it asks about barriers to reducing emissions. And so we're going to start, we'll spend about 8 to 10 minutes on the first question. Each person will have 3 Post-it notes per question, so 6 Post-it notes per person, and just kind of have a conversation about what you see as barriers or opportunities. Write those down, stick it on the appropriate flip chart paper. I'll call time for the first question, and then you'll flip it over, have more discussion, and then put your responses onto that flip chart. And so then we can collect that information and have that feedback as well. Are there questions at all? Okay, it's all clear? Okay, and then we can stay where we are and we'll move into the next thing from there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna bring it back to the full group. I think that it sounds like, see, it's time. All right, it sounds like you guys had pretty good conversations at your tables, so it wasn't quiet in here, so that's good. So we're gonna take your conversations and kind of reformat them and use this tool again so we can visualize some of your answers as well, and have conversations around, as a group, what you were talking about. So get your phones back out. Looks like none were left behind over here, so you should hopefully all have yours. And the website should just load where we were at, if you just get back in your browser. Right, so first question. So the first question is asking you what you see as the greatest challenge to Minnesota's current transportation system. So there's air quality, climate change, environmental justice, equitable access to mobility, high cost of driving, lack of public transportation options, quality of roads and bridges, safety, traffic, or something else. So it looks like climate change and lack of transportation, public transportation options, and then equitable access to mobility are up there. Okay, next. What are opportunities in your community to achieving a low carbon transportation system? So this one is going to be open-ended. You'll just write whatever comes to your mind, and then it should scroll up on the screen. So improve public transportation, equaling fewer vehicles, more biking and EV adoption, improve public transportation to reduce on-road vehicles, development of charging networks for vehicles, electric community buses, incentivize electric vehicles to be affordable and make public transportation more navigable, reworking our public transportation system to account for more ride sharing and busing, existing public transit, willingness in our family to carpool. Sometimes I have to read fast because it just disappears on me. So electric community buses, more navigable transportation systems. What does that look like? What do you guys envision that as in southwestern Minnesota?
Full self-driving rideshare.
Full self-driving rideshare. Yeah. What else?
That would be cool. It's the only way to actually solve the problems.
You have to cost that for those.
I want to make money on the Tesla.
Do you have a dealership?
Referral code if you want some free charging miles.
All right. Anything else? What do you guys envision for that? A number of people put that up there. Yeah.
Really just some sort of a public transit system that honestly serves the communities in the areas. Like having the home health and social services have a bus that'll take you to the grocery store, the doctor, the mall is great. People with mobility issues, but how can we improve on that so that people are actually incentivized not to drive?
How do we make it easier, right, to replace that? Other thoughts? Okay.
Yeah, I think I could buttress that. How do you balance the convenience and the cost to the environment? So if you have a bus that can take you anywhere for $1 or $2, because the community bus, is it what if you're the only one sitting in there?
Right.
As opposed to if you had an electric one, you wanna, can you offset the cost to the environment? Perhaps you could, but then are you getting enough people riding the electric one as well?
Right.
So that could be a challenge.
Right. So just having a bus for a bus sake
Mhm.
isn't necessarily going to solve the problems unless you can also figure out how to increase ridership.
Yes.
Okay. Next question. What are barriers in your community to achieving a low carbon transportation system? So this is one you talked about a bit. Also open-ended. Okay. So we have lack of bikeable routes, lack of charging infrastructure, low usage of public transportation, access to affordable hybrids and electric vehicles, rural area objections to changing the system, low population density. People don't realize that public transportation can actually feel more convenient, so they don't want to use it. Entrenched habits, which I think is a euphemism for ignorance and selfishness. Maybe not. It says it up there. I didn't make that up. Low population density. People don't realize. I read that one. Access to affordable hybrids and electric vehicles. Is that all that we've done? Okay. Anybody want to share their thoughts on this one? Yeah.
I actually had entrenched habits.
Yeah.
I was thinking more along the lines of, so if you decide one of the ways you want to fix this is to have like robust public transportation that's low or no emission. Even if you spend a lot of time and money establishing that system, if people aren't reminded that it is now there and that now it's more convenient, then they're just going to continue to like behave the same way they did. Right. So there's got to be some way to like sort of constantly remind people that this is an option, this is convenient, etc. You know, I mean, all the different benefits of it for them.
So motivating behavior change.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I think one of the things with that entrenched idea, a lot of the things we're trying to replace one for one. So we're trying to get a bus to do the same thing your car does, and that doesn't work. What we need to do is convince people that what a bus does has benefits unto itself, and that changing your habits to make the bus work for you is worth at least considering or exploring. Now maybe it won't work for everybody based on route times and things like that, but if you can go into your office and get your shift moved an hour earlier, start an hour earlier, leave an hour later, now all of a sudden the bus works for you, that's a change that can be made.
Sure. But maybe now we have kind of inflexibility on either end, and flexibility in kind of the transit system and maybe your job or your schedule. So how can we think about matching those better on both ends?
Yeah, and I think that's, I don't want to use that as the only example of this, but it's the same thing with the electric vehicle, driving out to California in 2 days. That instead of stopping when you need to pee, you just pee every 2 hours instead, and then you're not stopping in between. And it's a change in the way that you're making these stops, but not necessarily a worse approach. And that's more what I was pushing with the work shift, rather than whether or not that's flexible.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to suggest something along similar lines, that our heart, something I learned when I worked in the developing world, and I think we're the developing world actually, but anyway, was that we take too much notice of this, and so the clock, the watch, right? And so we need to really be a lot more flexible in lots of ways, you know, and employment is an example, if we can be, you know, and if we didn't worry so much about this, maybe we could be, I don't know. And that flexibility would help in transportation too. Public transport from little towns to bigger towns so that people could get to work and home and etc.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Some sense.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, next question. To what extent do you support the following technologies and strategies? So this is going to be a scale on you don't support it to you strongly support it. Improve public transportation, which includes quality, speed, frequency, other aspects that you might think could be improved. Increased number of electric vehicle chargers, electric commercial trucks and heavy-duty vehicles, electric buses and trains, or personal electric vehicles, and personal. Okay. So it looks like there's pretty strong support for these technologies. Is there anyone that you would like favor over? We don't really do this as a ranking, but just kind of getting a sense of support. But is there anything that you might favor over the others? Or the opposite and want less over than the others? You want them all now?
Yes.
No. Yeah. What is,
as a model of responsible stewardship, like anything that you can do that would reduce the total number of vehicles on the road should be favorable.
okay.
Anything you can do to reduce your total impact
Mhm.
should be favorable. So personal electric vehicles are great, but how can we reduce the number of people who feel that they need to have an electric vehicle? Or how can we change our lifestyle and restructure our culture so that owning a car is not an access point to, the middle class?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you, but I think perhaps the issue right now is how much it costs to the environment to manufacture the electric vehicle and to manufacture the equipment, the battery packs and all that. We still rely on the dirty fuel to do those things.
Right.
Now, if we no longer, some time in the future, if we're able to use renewable and cleaner original source of energy, perhaps that wouldn't be such an issue anymore. Whether you choose to have your own personal vehicle or to go with an electric transportation, public transportation, for example. Now, if we're not increasing the carbon footprint, when we get to a point where we don't do that so much, then it shouldn't really matter whether you should incentivize, taking public transportation.
Kelly, would it be fair to say that you would prefer a society where you didn't need a vehicle to be in the middle class,
Yeah.
even if it wasn't for carbon emissions?
I would prefer a society where I could live not in major metro area and not have to have a vehicle in order to also be able to work and support a family.
I think it's just down to habits. I mean, in the United Kingdom, it's a small place, but people don't. In the big cities, people don't use vehicles as much.
Right.
Because if you have your underground train that comes every 3 minutes, why would you need to drive and then go pay £25 to park your vehicle for the day because you work in the city?
Well, yeah, when I was living in Minneapolis for school, I never drove. I didn't have a car. Out here, I absolutely need one. But I feel like we're taking two different approaches to the same endpoint.
Yeah, I think I do hear you agreeing.
So I think in the rural area, I mean, the electric buses and trains, while nice concept, is unlikely to happen. So maybe the biggest impact is the bottom one, is the
Personal electric vehicles.
yeah.
And then that would also require increased number of electric vehicle charges. So if
Yeah.
you prioritize the bottom one, you've got to prioritize that one too to make it feasible.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, next question. To what extent do you support the following technologies and strategies? So now we're looking at biofuels and low carbon fuels, shared vehicles, walkable and bikeable communities, and corn ethanol. And again, this is from don't support it to strongly support it.
Point of clarification.
Yeah.
Is corn ethanol considered not a biofuel?
So I think for the biofuels and low carbon fuels, yeah, we're considering a lower carbon approach to that than corn ethanol. Mm-hmm. Okay, so pretty strong support for shared vehicles and walkable and bikeable communities. And then also stronger support for biofuels and low carbon fuels, and then kind of middle of the road support for corn ethanol. How do you envision shared vehicles in southwestern Minnesota? Do you think it happens in kind of the regional centers, or do you think it could happen in smaller communities? What do you envision? Would you share your Tesla?
I would be interested in a full or if it was full self-driving rideshare, I would put mine on the rideshare service.
Okay.
So especially if there's income involved in it, that if that offsets my cost to own the vehicle, I think that's the only way to make it work.
Yeah.
I feel like just using some existing companies, I feel like more of a zip car model would be preferable to an Uber Lyft because.
Can you explain the zip car model?
Zip car, you have a code to get into the car and you drive it and it charges your account for how many miles you drive. And then you just leave the car and then when it's time to go somewhere else you find another zip car and go. As opposed to an Uber Lyft model because that incentivizes people to just sit in their car and let it idle.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Well, when I think about shared vehicles, maybe I think a little broader. I think of a way that as people are coming into Marshall, which I think upwards of 10,000 people a day coming to work here, maybe there would be some type of ride share system developed, or a way for people to communicate and talk about, hey, let's, instead of everybody driving their own car into town, could we, connect at least 3 out of 5 days a week and do it, or something.
Yeah, so a better understanding of where people are coming from and coordinating around that.
Yeah, it'd be nice if there was some type of coordination there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Next. What is most important additional benefit that you see for your community in reducing transportation emissions? So we've talked a lot about reducing carbon emissions, but there's other benefits that can be associated with any number of these strategies, including improving air quality, supporting local jobs, providing more mobility options, promoting equity and environmental justice, and making communities more resilient to climate change, and then other ideas that you might have. That top yellow one is promoting equity and environmental justice, and then the lighter blue is making communities more resilient to climate change, and the darker blue is more mobility options. Anybody want to share their answer for this one?
All I'd like to say is that it's very difficult to only choose one.
Okay. Yeah.
Even though the online survey.
It's true. In the online survey, you can choose more. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we also will have a feedback form as well, so you can put your preferences there as well. Anything else? Nobody picked other? Okay, next. How important to you is it that environmental justice shapes action to reduce greenhouse gas in Minnesota? And the question came up in the afternoon meeting of like, how do you even define environmental justice? And I'm not going to define it for you. I think that that's up to you all to think about what that means to you. You guys have thoughts on that question or what it means to you? I feel like I see an intake of breath. Ready?
Yeah. Well, it seems so often when there's challenges with the environment, it's people who are economically disadvantaged that are impacted the most by it. And then also the other thing about environmental justice, sometimes it's not just justice for people, sometimes it's for other life forms on the planet too. So I think it's a huge issue.
Thank you. Okay. So now we'll just talk about policies quickly and just a couple more questions. Almost there. What types of policies would you support as MnDOT works toward decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in transportation? So this again, sliding scale of don't support to strongly support, and we're looking for regulations for car manufacturers to offer more fuel efficient vehicles, funding for infrastructure like electric vehicle charging stations, funding for electric buses, or funding for vehicles rather, an example is electric buses, incentives for vehicle upgrades or replacements, incentives for adopting new clean fuel technology, which includes production of clean, low-carbon fuels and new biofuel blends. Okay. So it looks like fairly strong support for these various policies. Are there any that you might favor more than another?
I think everybody wants better fuel efficiency.
Yeah. So better fuel efficiency. You pay less at the pump either way, right? So what else? Thoughts? Do you have any thoughts? No? Okay. We can go to the next one. What types of policies would you support? Again, so this is looking at requirements to include multimodal transportation options in community design and transportation projects, fees on fossil fuels like gasoline and diesel, market-based efforts that incorporate a price on carbon, investment in research to develop new technologies, investment in research to research emissions from biofuels. Okay, so maybe slightly less favorable on these set of policies. Investment in research, did you try to give that one a 10? Yeah. That one has the highest support in here. And then followed by other investment in research to reduce emissions from biofuels and new technologies. Sorry, I didn't clarify. And market-based solutions seem to have the strongest support. Any thoughts on these policies?
All I would say is that I know my new country here, I am a citizen here, and if I don't speak like you, I am aware when I compare America with Europe and where I came from, Australia, and realise the cost of gas in those countries compared to here. You don't even know what high gas prices are. We don't here, okay? But what effect has that had on the development of the car industries in those countries? They don't have big, monstrous vehicles like we do here that guzzle down the gas because it costs too much. So that's why I am somewhat in favour of higher gas prices. Plus, we need to pay for our roads and bridges somehow. So, because we want them, and we don't want to die on them. So we don't have to. So, yeah, I think for various reasons, the economic system is not. It favours winners and losers. Now it's not a level playing field, and at the moment some oil and gas and whatever are advantaged at the expense of other things. So why not do it the other way around?
Other thoughts? I think we just have one more question. So this last one is just who's here? Who showed up? So MnDOT this won't be public and it won't pop up on the screen and won't be shared with anybody. But MnDOT just wants to get a sense of who's coming to the meetings and making sure that they're understanding who's represented and who might be missing from conversations so that we can try to capture that as well. And then there is also a feedback form at each of your tables, and we would appreciate it if you filled those out as well. And the final question, I always forget about this one, it's important, but what is the one thing that you want MnDOT to take away from this meeting? So what is most important to you that you want MnDOT to hear? And you can share that aloud if you would like as well. So the poll is still open, but Jesse's going to go back to the slides. I'm going to turn it back over to Tim, but we really appreciate your conversations. I hope that you had good conversations at your table as well, and we're happy to have heard what you've had to say. So
yeah. Thanks, Abby. Yeah, and thank you all for spending your evening with us. This was really, really helpful, really informative, and it was a great treat to have so many people show up tonight. This was a very pleasant surprise. Whenever we go out to these meetings, we always want a full room. For us, for an evening meeting, this feels like a full room. So this is terrific, and we had a great participation this afternoon too. So. Yeah, really sincere thanks to all of you and everyone else who came this afternoon. I think we might have had somebody show up a couple times today. Thank you, sir. So we have we've got one more set of public meetings tomorrow in Rochester, in case anyone feels like road tripping. We'd love to hear from you as much as possible. But after that, I guess I want to let you know that this is not for nothing, right? The work that you put in is going to be factored into next steps we're going to take. So when the public meetings wrap up, we're going to start compiling all this information, all the feedback that we've gotten from you in person, in writing, both on paper and the Mentimeter, and then also on our website. If anyone wants to provide more feedback on the MnDOT website, if you search MnDOT Sustainability or MnDOT and Pathways, there's a survey form online. You can also provide written feedback. I think as of last week, we had around 300 survey responses as well. So we're going to be compiling all this information in later this month, July, and probably early August. We're going to summarize it into a report that will then get shared with all of our sister agencies because this is a multi-agency process, an effort. And then it will also be shared with the governor. So the plan is that we'll be summarizing this information and then providing some recommendations on actions that the state can take to make progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So those are going to really be driven largely by the feedback we hear from you and others from around the state. So with that, Abby mentioned the survey. The survey, we love to hear feedback, both on this particular effort, but also in the way that the public meetings are conducted in general. That's something we want to constantly improve on. So any and all feedback is appreciated there as well. And I think, is there anything else I'm forgetting?
All right. From MN350,
Yes.
we wanted to have folks gather just for a few minutes and talk about some next steps on our end as well.
All right. Okay, well then with that, thank you all again for coming and have a terrific evening.